My name is Jessica Nolan. I'm 32, and the night my mother and my sister told me they had sold my house was the moment I realized the people who raised me were capable of things I never thought possible. I had just come home from a brutal 12-hour ER shift, still in my scrubs keys in my hand, when I saw them standing on the porch like they'd been waiting for their cue. No greeting, no hesitation. Just the first hit thrown straight at my face. "We sold your house." I froze for half a second, not because I didn't hear it, but because of how casually they said it, like mentioning the weather. Then came the second blow, sharper than the first. "You're basically homeless now." They watched me, the way people watch a glass fall off a table, waiting for the moment it shatters. They expected a meltdown, a scene, something that would make all of this funnier for them. But I didn't give them any of that. I didn't yell. I didn't ask why. I didn't even blink. I just smiled, a slow, controlled smile that made both of them shift their weight, like suddenly they weren't sure who exactly was holding the upper hand here. One of them snapped, "What's so funny?" And I said, "The house you sold was actually—" I let the rest of the sentence hang in the air unfinished because the truth behind it was the kind of truth that doesn't just hurt, it destroys. They had no idea what they'd stepped into. They thought they'd blindsided me. They thought they'd won. But in that moment, the only thought in my head was this: if they're proud of what they just did, wait until they see what comes next. If you think family can't go this far, you haven't heard the rest. Follow the story. Trust me, it only gets worse for them from here. The first moment I realized something was wrong didn't happen on a porch or during an argument. It happened on an ordinary night after a 12-hour ER shift, when all I wanted was silence and a hot shower. I tossed my ID badge on the table, leaned back on the couch, and checked my phone out of habit. That was when the email appeared, a single line of text that sliced through the exhaustion in an instant request to update property ownership details. I sat up straight. Nothing about that subject line made sense. I opened it quickly, expecting some kind of clerical mix-up, but the message was clear. Someone had submitted a form to adjust ownership information for my house. The email showed a timestamp from earlier that afternoon, a time when I had been stitching a patient with a fractured forearm. I called the bank immediately. The representative verified my identity, typed for a moment, then told me something I still remember word for word. "The request was confirmed this morning by a family member acting on your behalf." My stomach tightened. I told her no such permission existed, but she insisted the confirmation had gone through on a recorded line. When I asked for details, she read notes indicating the caller was a relative authorized by the homeowner. My head started pulsing. I pulled out my folder of documents, flipped to my signature samples, and compared them to the digital form attached to the email. The signature looked close enough to pass a glance, but the shape of the letters felt wrong. The loops were exaggerated, and the slant leaned too far left. I knew instantly it wasn't mine. I called my mother. She answered quickly, but sounded rushed, like she was standing in the middle of a conversation she didn't want me to hear. When I explained what the bank said, she dismissed it without hesitation, saying something vague about online systems glitching. Before I could push further, she cut the call short, claiming she needed to handle something. The abruptness clung to me long after the call ended. I tried reaching my sister next, but every call went to voicemail. I texted her, and she left the messages on read without replying. That wasn't surprising given her history of avoiding responsibility, but suddenly the silence felt calculated. Over the next days, small memories resurfaced and rearranged themselves into something sharper. A recent dinner where my mother asked whether I had considered refinancing. Another night when my sister avoided meeting my eyes when the topic of home repairs came up. At the time, those moments felt like nothing, just family chatter. Now they felt rehearsed, intentional. I began saving everything: emails, notification logs, screenshots, call records. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew better than to ignore patterns. The more I documented, the more unsettled I felt. Part of me rebelled at the idea that my own family could ever step over a line as serious as property records. Another part of me, the part trained to notice inconsistencies in patients' stories, recognized the signs immediately. People don't get distant for no reason. People don't avoid simple questions unless the truth matters. Still, I forced myself not to jump to conclusions. I refused to accuse anyone until I understood the full extent of what was happening. If this was a mistake, confronting them too soon would only push them away. If it wasn't a mistake, then I needed every piece of evidence I could gather. A week passed. No more strange questions, no suspicious conversations. Almost enough quiet to make me wonder whether I had overreacted. Then another message arrived from the bank this time, not a request, but a status notification: ownership modification in progress. Action pending. The blood drained from my face as I stared at the screen. This wasn't an error. Someone was moving forward. Someone was confident I wouldn't notice. And whoever they were counting on to confirm things on my behalf definitely wasn't me. The next morning, I decided that guessing wasn't enough. I needed answers from someone who handled the paperwork directly. So instead of calling, I drove to the brokerage office and asked to speak with whoever had processed the recent changes on my property file. The employee who greeted me pulled up the documents quickly, her expression shifting the moment she opened the authorization form. Without saying anything, she rotated the screen slightly. The expiration date was printed clearly near the top, and it had passed months earlier. She explained that expired authorizations were considered invalid the moment they lapsed. That alone should have stopped the transaction. Then she opened another note linked to my file. It was short but sharp: client confirmed by phone, voice consistent with homeowner. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. I told her there was no world in which I made that call. She looked taken aback, but she didn't argue. Instead, she asked if anyone close to me might try to handle something in my name. I said no, but the question pulled up a memory I hadn't touched in years: my sister joking around when we were younger, copying my tone so well, she once convinced a neighbor I was speaking from another room. I pushed the memory down, refusing to jump to conclusions, but it sat uncomfortably in the back of my mind. The broker continued describing the call. According to her, the person on the line had spoken quickly, insisted the paperwork needed to be pushed through immediately, and kept repeating that it was a family emergency. The phrasing made my stomach go cold. It was exactly the sort of story my mother used whenever she wanted me to cover something for my sister, wrap the chaos in a sentimental excuse so I'd feel guilty if I didn't help. I thanked the broker and stepped outside, the sun hitting my eyes in a way that made the whole situation feel more surreal. I sat in the car and tried to piece together the timeline, each detail slotting into place more cleanly than I wanted it to. The expired authorization, the voice confirmation, the urgency. None of it resembled an accident. I needed someone who specialized in this. Someone who wouldn't sugarcoat it. I reached out to an investigator named Carla Ruiz, a woman known for handling property fraud cases. At her office, she listened to every detail with the kind of focus that made me feel both exposed and validated. After I finished, she asked a few pointed questions: who had access to my personal information, whether anyone in my family had recent financial trouble, whether I had noticed changes in behavior. Each question narrowed the picture. When she finally leaned back in her chair, her conclusion came without hesitation. She told me that using an expired authorization form paired with impersonating a homeowner on a recorded call aligned with clear signs of fraud. She explained that intent mattered. If someone knowingly used lapsed documents and pretended to be me, the motive wasn't confusion, it was opportunity. Carla advised me to gather every piece of communication I could: emails, call, log statements from my bank, anything that showed unusual activity. She emphasized documenting everything quietly until I had a full timeline. Then she asked if anyone close to me had been struggling financially. The question didn't need an answer, I already had it. My sister's debts, my mother's constant excuses for her, the sudden interest they'd shown in my schedule, my stability, my home. Everything connected at once, and the realization felt both heavy and clarifying. By the time I stepped out of Carla's office, the denial I'd been holding on to had already begun to crumble. They weren't trying to protect the family, they were trying to save my sister's mess at my expense. That evening, after organizing the documents Carla told me to collect, I started the car and headed toward my mother's house, no longer willing to let any of them write the story for me. The moment I stepped back onto the porch, the air felt charged the way it does, right before a storm breaks, but neither my mother nor my sister seemed to sense the shift. They stood exactly where I left them, still wearing the smugness of people who believed the outcome had already been written in their favor. My mother launched straight into her speech, insisting that what she had done was an act of devotion, a sacrifice she made for the good of the family. She said it like she expected applause, like the word family could erase the trail of lies behind her. Before I could speak, my sister cut in, accusing me of never stepping up for anyone but myself. She claimed she and my mother were always the ones cleaning up after me, twisting history so sharply it almost sounded rehearsed. Her voice carried down the street loud enough that a neighbor out on an evening walk paused. She slowed, tugging her dog's leash, pretending to check her phone while her eyes drifted toward us. The pity in her expression hit me harder than the accusations themselves, not because I felt embarrassed, but because I finally understood my mother's intention. She didn't just want control. She wanted witnesses. She wanted me small. She wanted an audience for her version of the story. I held her stare without reacting, and that seemed to irritate my sister even more. She kept pushing, piling blame on me, painting herself as the one who always struggled because I supposedly refused to help. She didn't see the discomfort on the neighbor's face or the way the dog tugged, wanting to leave. She only noticed the sound of her own voice and the echo of my mother's approval. Then the front door swung open. A man stepped into the doorway, his expression shifting the moment he heard my sister's tone. He introduced himself as Adrian Foster, the buyer who had just closed on the house. He looked between the three of us, clearly trying to make sense of a situation he hadn't realized he had walked into. When my sister snapped again, he turned fully to me and asked quietly, "Are you the actual homeowner?" The question hung in the air, cutting through everything my mother had tried to stage. I told him yes, and then added that the authorization form used in the sale had expired months ago, which meant any transaction relying on it wouldn't hold. Adrian's brows pulled together, his confusion turning into something closer to worry. The shift on his face wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make my mother's certainty flicker. My sister stepped forward, her tone turning defensive and sharp, shouting that the house belonged to our mother because she had raised me and deserved something in return. She said it like parenting was a financial investment that entitled her to my life. She kept talking, layering accusations, hoping the noise would drown out the truth. It didn't. Adrian looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly as if preparing for a fallout he wanted no part of. The weight of what he'd been dragged into was finally settling in, and he glanced between us like someone who realized he might be standing in the middle of something illegal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just explained that I had reviewed every document tied to the transfer, and nothing about the process was valid. Not the authorization, not the confirmation, not the justification they were trying to spin in front of a stranger. My mother's mouth opened, then closed again, the confidence draining as she searched for something to say that would make this look less like what it was. My sister tried to interrupt, but the tremble behind her words betrayed her. I looked at my mother directly, steady and calm, and said, "I've checked everything. And what you pulled tonight isn't slipping past anyone, not anymore." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes when the truth finally arrives, and there's no place left to hide. The following day, I headed straight to Carla Ruiz's office, carrying everything I had collected. She set aside the file she'd been working on and gestured for me to hand her the folder. As she flipped through the documents, her expression tightened, not with surprise, but with recognition. When she finished reviewing the last page, she picked up her phone and said she needed to verify a few details before moving forward. Her first call was to the bank's fraud department. After confirming her identification, the representative pulled up the activity tied to my account and explained that a property-related authorization had been approved because someone over the phone matched the voice print notes of the account holder. Carla asked for the timestamp and the verification method, writing every detail with deliberate strokes. When the conversation wrapped up, she immediately moved on to the next step. She dialed the notary office listed in the sale paperwork. The clerk found the file and confirmed that the power of attorney had been used to process the document package. Carla requested the renewal date, and the clerk paused long enough to signal something was wrong. The power of attorney had expired months before the transaction. Carla thanked her, ended the call, and contacted the county recorder's office to check the transfer attempt. The county employee placed her on hold while reviewing the packet. When she returned, her voice had changed. She said the transaction appeared incomplete and potentially invalid. She added that the county would begin an internal review once they received Carla's report. Carla hung up and leaned back slightly, organizing her notes. She explained that impersonating a homeowner during a bank authorization is treated as identity fraud. An expired power of attorney cannot legally justify a property transfer, and the broker overseeing the process had failed to conduct the mandatory verification steps. She opened a case file, typed a summary of what she had confirmed, and asked whether I could bring the buyer in to provide a statement. I contacted Adrian Foster, and he arrived faster than I expected. Carla handed him the summary, and he read it with growing disbelief. His signature went at the bottom of the page, acknowledging that he had unknowingly walked into a compromised transaction. Carla attached his statement to the report and finalized the packet for the county. It didn't take long for the county to respond. A series of emails went out simultaneously to my mother and my sister, informing them that the attempted property transfer had been officially frozen pending legal review. Any attempt to alter ownership, process additional paperwork, or negotiate with another buyer was blocked. A second notice warned that they were required to comply with the investigation and that failure to respond could escalate the matter. A few minutes later, my phone lit up with call after call from my sister. When I declined the first one, she left a string of voice messages laced with frustration and accusations. She blamed me for dragging outsiders into family business and insisted everything could have been handled quietly. I was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when Annie walked past and noticed I kept flipping my phone face down. I told her what was going on, and she suggested I ignore every attempt to reach me because direct communication would only complicate the investigation. As the afternoon wound down, an official letter was delivered to my mother's house. It instructed her to appear for an interview with county investigators regarding irregularities tied to the attempted transfer. The notice emphasized that the inquiry was mandatory. It was no longer something she could talk her way out of, and for the first time, accountability was no longer optional. The following evening, I met Adrian Foster at a quiet seaside cafe where the windows faced the water and the late sun drew long reflections across the floor. He had chosen a table in the corner away from the other customers, and the moment I sat down, he pushed a slim envelope toward me. Inside was a printed confirmation of the deposit he had already paid for the house, an amount spelled out in firm, unforgiving words that made the reality of his loss impossible to soften. Adrian admitted he had spent most of the previous night trying to convince himself that I was the one escalating things, that maybe I had panicked, misunderstood something, or even exaggerated the situation out of anger at my family. He looked genuinely uncomfortable as he said it, but he told me the thought had crossed his mind because the version of events my mother had fed him made me seem like someone who avoided responsibility and left everything for her to manage. Without interrupting, I handed him the printed copy of the expired authorization, the series of emails from the county office, the flagged note from the notary, and the transcription showing that the confirmation call had come from someone using my name. He read slowly, his expression tightening with every page until he reached the note about the impersonated voice. He set the document down, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said quietly that he now understood exactly how deeply he had been pulled into a situation he never should have been part of. When he finally looked at me again, the hesitation was gone. He said we needed to take legal action, not just freezing the sale, but filing a formal lawsuit against both Evelyn and Brittany for fraud damages and emotional harm, and requesting that the county conduct a full investigation into the transaction. I told him I agreed to cooperate, but only if we kept everything professional, clean, and entirely focused on the legal violations rather than anger or personal revenge. Adrian accepted that without argument, saying he respected how I had handled everything so far. He also admitted something he had clearly been holding back. Evelyn had insisted I was overwhelmed by work, irresponsible with paperwork, and letting the house fall apart under neglect. He said that hearing the real documents made him realize he had been fed a narrative designed to justify the sale and paint me as the unstable party. As we stepped outside, a salty breeze carried snippets of conversation from a couple of neighbors sitting near the dunes. Their eyes flicked toward me quickly before darting away, and it was obvious the news about the frozen transaction had already begun circulating. On my way back to my car, I stopped at a small convenience store near my mother's neighborhood to buy a drink, and the store owner recognized me immediately. He leaned over the counter and lowered his voice, telling me that my sister had come by repeatedly during the last month, asking to borrow money, telling him and several others in the area that a major property sale was about to close, and she only needed a temporary loan until the big check cleared. According to him, she had promised repayment dates more than once, each one passing without a word. Hearing that made the situation snap into full clarity. This wasn't impulsive chaos, it was a pattern. When I walked outside, I saw a new email from Adrian with a draft outlining the first legal steps, joint filing request for restitution, and a detailed timeline of the fraudulent actions. The momentum had shifted permanently. What my mother and sister had started was no longer a family issue. It had become a legal fire, and now that fire had caught, and they had nowhere left to step back. By the time the weekend arrived, the tension around my mother's house had grown so thick that even the neighbors felt something was coming, and they were right. Late that morning, 2 officers stepped onto Evelyn's porch with a precision that said they had already reviewed every document. I watched from my car half a block away as they knocked, and when Evelyn opened the door, her smile fell the moment they introduced themselves and stated the purpose of their visit. They requested to go over the paperwork connected to the attempted sale, and once inside, they began reading each violation aloud. Even from where I was parked, I could sense her discomfort intensifying as they listed impersonation through a phone confirmation, the expired authorization used during the transaction, the altered signature, and the inconsistencies in the notary statement. I knew Evelyn would try to talk her way out of each point, but the pauses growing longer between her answers told me she no longer had explanations left. Brittany came rushing into the living room when she realized the officers were questioning her mother. Before she could ask what was happening, her phone vibrated sharply in her hand. She glanced at the screen and froze. A debt collection notice had arrived demanding repayment in an amount written fully in letters that seemed to stun her speechless. A second later, panic erupted. She began pacing and muttering that this wasn't possible, that somebody must have added extra fees, and within moments she was shouting that Evelyn had promised everything would be covered once the house sold. Evelyn snapped, claiming she had only gone along with the plan because Brittany insisted they were running out of time. The officers tried to regain control of the conversation, but the 2 of them were too deep in their own spiral to listen. Their voices grew louder, echoing through the open doorway and carrying across the lawn where several neighbors had gathered. People filmed with their phones, whispering among themselves as the Nolan family's private disaster became a public spectacle. For years, Evelyn had built an image of steady respectability, hosting holiday gatherings and keeping up perfect appearances, and now that image disintegrated on her front steps while half the neighborhood watched. A few minutes later, Carla Ruiz arrived, walking with the deliberate calm of someone who knew the law was fully on her side. She greeted the officers, spoke briefly, and then addressed Evelyn directly. Carla explained that the county had reviewed the case and was moving forward with civil action. Evelyn would be required to pay a written compensation deposit immediately to prevent the county from seizing additional assets. Brittany tried to cut in, begging for leniency, insisting they didn't understand the pressure, but Carla shut her down and stated that both of them were responsible for the violations. As if the situation weren't explosive enough, the store owner from earlier approached the officers and said Brittany owed him money as well. Two neighbors followed, saying Brittany had borrowed from them with promises tied to the sale of the house. Their voices were steady, irritated, and completely done with excuses. The officers documented each statement as Evelyn and Brittany continued arguing, Evelyn blaming Brittany for pushing her toward fraud, Brittany accusing Evelyn of manipulating her and creating a disaster she couldn't escape. What struck me most was the desperation in their voices, not because they were innocent, but because for the first time they had no one left to guilt pressure or manipulate into solving their problems. I stayed in my car, watching quietly as the officers continued gathering statements and Carla prepared the necessary forms. Neither Evelyn nor Brittany knew I was there, and I had no intention of stepping forward. They had made their choices long before this day arrived. For the first time in their lives, they had to face the consequences without me. The final hearing unfolded with a calm that felt almost unreal compared to everything that had led to it. I sat before the judge as he reviewed the remaining documents, his tone firm and decisive as he confirmed that every attempt to transfer my property, every signature, every confirmation call, every piece of expired authorization was invalid. With a single ruling, the transaction was declared void, and ownership of the house was restored to me without conditions. There were no dramatic outbursts from Evelyn or Brittany. They weren't even there. Their attorneys appeared in their place, offering explanations that sounded more like apologies polished for legal effect than genuine accountability. When the judge dismissed the hearing, I stepped out of the courthouse with a clarity I didn't expect to feel. The house no longer represented stability or achievement. It was a symbol of how far they were willing to go to exploit me. So instead of returning to it, I decided then that I would let it go entirely. Within weeks, I completed the necessary paperwork, listed the house, and sold it to a young family who walked through the rooms with excitement in their eyes. Watching them take ownership felt like the first sign that the chapter was not ending in bitterness, but in reclamation. With the sale complete, I moved to a quiet neighborhood just outside Charleston, a place surrounded by clean air, wide streets, and the kind of calm that doesn't require justification. I set up my new life with simple decisions, a new phone number, new mailing address, and a clean boundary. I blocked every call from Evelyn and Brittany and asked my carrier to filter all unfamiliar numbers. The only contact I allowed to pass through was mail from the court, because that was the only communication still rooted in necessity rather than manipulation. A few days after settling in, Adrian Foster sent me a short email thanking me for being transparent throughout the process. He said my cooperation helped him understand the truth long before his frustration could turn into resentment. I thanked him for his message, kept the tone respectful, and kept the boundary intact. Our connection existed because of a crisis, not because of something that should be carried further. Once everything quieted, I finally had the space to examine what the last few months had really shown me. For years, I had tried to convince myself that endurance was a form of love, that staying silent or stepping aside made me a loyal daughter and a patient sister. But none of that was true. Loyalty without respect is submission. Forgiveness given out of fear is not forgiveness at all. And love that demands you sacrifice your own stability isn't love, it's control dressed in sentiment. This country's laws exist to protect individuals even when the threat comes from someone who shares their bloodline. Blood is not a shield from consequences. And cutting ties is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the only way to ensure the damage stops with you. Standing in my new driveway one morning, the final court letters tucked away in my desk, I realized I no longer owed them explanations or access or chances to rewrite the past. The history was theirs. The future was mine. I got into my car just as the first light of day touched the skyline and headed toward the long bridge leading into Charleston. The sunrise stretched across the water like a quiet promise, and as I drove forward, leaving the last shadow of the Nolan house behind me, I understood with absolute certainty that I had finally stepped into a life that belonged only to me. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.